The night sky over Hanoi erupted in a display of fire and light more intense than anything witnessed in the history of aerial warfare. It was December 18, 1972, and the citizens of North Vietnam's capital city looked up in terror and disbelief as wave after wave of massive 8-engine bombers thundered overhead, their bomb bays opening to release torrents of high-explosive ordnance that transformed entire city blocks into rubble and flame. This was Operation Linebacker II, and for the next 11 days, the full, unrestrained power of American strategic air power would be unleashed against North Vietnam with a ferocity and concentration that would shock the world and force one of the most resilient military forces of the 20th century to capitulate at the negotiating table. The North Vietnamese had laughed at the B-52 Stratofortress, dismissing it as an obsolete relic of the Cold War, a lumbering giant designed to fight the previous war, wholly unsuited to the complexities of modern conflict in Southeast Asia. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they had been. To understand the full impact and significance of Operation Linebacker II, we must first comprehend the context in which it occurred and the long, frustrating road that led American decision-makers to authorize such a massive application of air power. By late 1972, the United States had been involved in Vietnam for over a decade, and the American public's patience with the conflict had long since expired. President Richard Nixon had campaigned on a promise of peace with honor, pledging to end American involvement in the war while ensuring that South Vietnam would survive as an independent nation. His administration had pursued a policy called Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American ground forces while building up South Vietnamese military capabilities and relying increasingly on air power to compensate for the reduction in American ground troops. By December 1972, nearly all American ground combat forces had been withdrawn from Vietnam, leaving only a small number of advisors and support personnel. Throughout 1972, peace negotiations had been ongoing in Paris between the United States, represented primarily by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and North Vietnam, represented by Le Duc Tho. These negotiations had been maddeningly slow, characterized by North Vietnamese intransigence and what American negotiators viewed as deliberate stalling tactics. The North Vietnamese appeared to believe that time was on their side, that American domestic political pressure would eventually force the United States to accept any terms just to end the war, and that they could therefore afford to be patient and unyielding in their demands. This calculation was not unreasonable. The American anti-war movement was powerful and vocal. Congress was increasingly hostile to continued military involvement in Southeast Asia, and the 1972 presidential election had demonstrated that ending the war was a paramount concern for American voters. In October 1972, it had appeared that a breakthrough was imminent. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho had reached what seemed to be a tentative agreement, and Kissinger had made his famous announcement that peace was at hand. However, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu had refused to accept the agreement, arguing that it left too many North Vietnamese troops in place in South Vietnam and did not adequately guarantee his government's survival. The Nixon administration found itself caught between its South Vietnamese ally, who felt betrayed by the proposed terms, and the North Vietnamese, who now accused the Americans of negotiating in bad faith. The talks broke down completely in December, with the North Vietnamese walking away from the negotiating table and showing no inclination to return. President Nixon faced a decision that would define his presidency and the final chapter of American involvement in Vietnam. He could accept the collapse of negotiations and allow the war to continue indefinitely, which was politically impossible, given domestic opposition and congressional hostility. He could abandon South Vietnam and accept whatever terms North Vietnam dictated, which would mean the certain collapse of the Saigon government and a humiliating defeat for the United States. or he could attempt to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table through the application of overwhelming military force, demonstrating that the United States still possessed both the capability and the will to inflict unacceptable damage on North Vietnam if its leaders refused to negotiate seriously. Nixon chose the third option, and the result was Operation Linebacker II, the most concentrated application of strategic air power since World War II. The B-52 Stratofortress, which would be the primary instrument of this campaign, was indeed an old aircraft by 1972 standards. The first B-52s had entered service in 1955, and the basic design dated back to the late 1940s. The aircraft was enormous, with a wingspan of 185 feet and a length of 160 feet. It was powered by 8 turbojet engines mounted in 4 pods beneath the wings, giving it a distinctive appearance and a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. The B-52 had been designed as a high-altitude strategic bomber, intended to penetrate Soviet air defenses and deliver nuclear weapons against targets deep inside the Soviet Union. Its original mission profile called for it to fly at altitudes above 50,000 feet, where contemporary fighters and surface-to-air missiles would have difficulty reaching it, and to rely on speed, altitude, and electronic countermeasures to survive in hostile airspace. However, the evolution of surface-to-air missile technology, particularly the Soviet SA-2 guideline missile, had made high-altitude penetration increasingly dangerous by the 1960s. The SA-2 was specifically designed to engage high-altitude bombers, and it was devastatingly effective when properly employed. The missile had a maximum altitude of over 80,000 feet and carried a 440-pound warhead that could destroy a B-52 with a near miss, let alone a direct hit. North Vietnam had received hundreds of SA-2 missiles and associated radar systems from the Soviet Union, and by 1972 they had developed considerable expertise in employing these weapons. North Vietnamese air defense operators had years of experience tracking and engaging American aircraft. They had shot down numerous fighters and bombers over the course of the war, and they had learned to overcome or work around American electronic countermeasures through a combination of tactical innovation and Soviet technical assistance. The North Vietnamese also possessed a substantial force of anti-aircraft artillery, ranging from small-caliber automatic weapons to large-caliber radar-directed guns, and they maintained a small but capable air force of MiG fighters. Most importantly, they had constructed an integrated air defense system around Hanoi and Haiphong, the 2 most critical target areas in North Vietnam. This system linked radar sites, missile batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter bases into a coordinated network that could concentrate defensive fires against attacking aircraft. The defenses around Hanoi were particularly formidable, with multiple overlapping rings of SA-2 missile sites, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, and fighter bases within minutes of the capital. Western intelligence analysts considered the Hanoi air defense system to be one of the most heavily defended target areas in the world, comparable to or exceeding the defenses that had protected targets in Nazi Germany during World War II. Given these realities, the North Vietnamese had reason to feel confident about their ability to defend against B-52 attacks. They knew the aircraft was old, they knew it was designed for a different kind of warfare, and they had shot down B-52s before in previous operations. The aircraft was large, making it an excellent radar target. It was not particularly maneuverable, especially at the lower altitudes where it had to operate to improve bombing accuracy. Its defensive armament consisted only of a tail turret with 4.50 caliber machine guns, later replaced by a single 20 cannon, hardly adequate protection against modern fighters or missiles. The North Vietnamese believed, with considerable justification, that if the Americans were foolish enough to send B-52s Against Hanoi in large numbers, they would suffer prohibitive losses. They had prepared their defenses, stockpiled missiles and ammunition, and trained their crews. They were ready, and they expected to inflict a defeat on American air power that would resonate around the world. Operation Linebacker II commenced on the evening of December 18, 1972. The operational plan called for massive strikes against targets in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas over a period of several days, with the explicit goal of destroying North Vietnam's war-making capacity and forcing its leadership back to negotiations. The target list included railroad yards, power plants, communications facilities, warehouses, petroleum storage areas, and air defense installations. Conspicuously absent from the target list were hospitals, schools, residential areas, and the system of dikes that controlled flooding in the Red River Delta, despite North Vietnamese propaganda claims to the contrary, which would characterize Linebacker II as carpet bombing or terror bombing of civilian areas. The operation was carefully planned to strike military and industrial targets while minimizing civilian casualties to the extent possible in an urban environment. The first night's attacks involved 129 B-52 drawn from bases in Thailand and Guam. The bombers from Thailand, primarily B-52Ds, had a relatively short flight to their targets, while those from Guam, primarily the more modern B-52Gs, faced a flight of over 2,500 miles each way, requiring aerial refueling and representing one of the longest combat missions regularly flown during the war. The bombers were organized into cells of 3 aircraft each, with multiple cells forming waves that would strike targets in succession. Each B-52 carried a massive bomb load, typically 27 tons of conventional bombs in the internal bomb bay and on external racks. This meant that each 3-plane cell could deliver approximately 81 tons of high explosives on target, and a wave of multiple cells could saturate a target area with hundreds of tons of bombs in a matter of minutes. The planning for these missions was extraordinarily complex. Routes had to be carefully calculated to minimize exposure to known missile sites. Timing had to be precisely coordinated so that support aircraft, including fighter escorts, Wild Weasel defense suppression aircraft, and electronic warfare aircraft, would be in position when needed. The bombers had to approach their targets from specific directions, maintain precise altitudes and airspeeds, and execute their bomb runs with minimal deviation from planned parameters. This rigidity was necessary for several reasons. First, it allowed the bombardiers to achieve maximum accuracy using their radar bombing systems. Second, it enabled the bombers to maximize the effectiveness of their electronic countermeasures, which worked best when multiple aircraft operated in close formation, concentrating their jamming power. Third, it simplified command and control, allowing commanders to track the progress of the mission and respond to contingencies. However, this rigidity also created vulnerabilities. The North Vietnamese air defense system was sophisticated enough to detect patterns in American tactics. Their radar operators could predict where the bombers would approach from, what altitudes they would fly at, and what routes they would follow. This allowed North Vietnamese missile batteries to pre-position and prepare firing solutions before the bombers even arrived in the target area. The Soviet advisors working with the North Vietnamese had specifically trained them to exploit the predictability of American tactics, and they had developed procedures for launching missiles in salvos, with multiple missiles being fired at each bomber to overwhelm its countermeasures and increase the probability of a hit. As the first waves of B-52s approached Hanoi on the night of December 18th, the North Vietnamese defenders were ready and waiting. The night sky lit up with the bright orange glows of SA-2 launches, missiles roaring up from their launchers on pillars of flame, their rocket motors burning intensely as they accelerated toward their targets. North Vietnamese radar operators guided the missiles toward the bomber formations, watching their screens intently, making minute adjustments to the missiles' trajectories. The SA-2 was not a fire-and-forget weapon. It required continuous guidance from ground-based radars until it reached the vicinity of its target, where its own seeker head would activate and guide it through the final approach to detonation. The B-52 crews could see the missiles coming. The SA-2 left a distinctive trail as it climbed, and the bomber's radar warning receivers screamed alerts as North Vietnamese targeting radars illuminated them. The electronic warfare officers in each B-52 worked frantically, operating their jamming equipment, dispensing chaff, attempting to deceive or confuse the incoming missiles. Some missiles went astray, their guidance corrupted by jamming or spoofed by chaff. Others kept coming, homing in on their targets with deadly accuracy. When an SA-2 detonated, it did so in a massive explosion that sent thousands of steel fragments scattering through the air at supersonic velocities. A B-52 caught in this blast could be shredded, its wings torn off, its fuselage punctured in dozens of places, its engines destroyed, its fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. On that first night, 3 B-52s were shot down over North Vietnam. Each loss represented 6 crew members killed or captured, a multi-million-dollar aircraft destroyed, and a significant psychological blow to the American aircrews who now understood that they were facing lethal defenses that could kill them despite all their technology and training. The North Vietnamese celebrated these victories, broadcasting news of the shootdowns and displaying wreckage to journalists. They believed they had proven their point, that the B-52 was vulnerable, that American air power could be defeated, and that the bombing campaign would fail just as previous campaigns had failed. But the Americans did not stop. On December 19th, another wave of B-52 struck Hanoi. On December 20th, more bombers came. Each night, the massive aircraft returned, their bomb bays full, their crews determined. Despite the losses, and despite the terrifying intensity of the defenses they faced, the North Vietnamese fired missiles by the dozens, sometimes launching their entire inventory at a single wave of bombers, filling the sky with missiles in the hope of overwhelming the American countermeasures through sheer numbers. The tactic worked on several occasions. More B-52s fell from the sky, their burning wreckage crashing into rice paddies and city outskirts. By December 22nd, 9 B-52s had been lost, along with numerous other aircraft types. The North Vietnamese were running short of missiles but remained defiant, confident that they were winning a war of attrition. However, something was changing on the ground in North Vietnam, something that the political and military leadership in Hanoi was beginning to recognize with growing alarm. The bombing was not having the effect of previous campaigns, which had been characterized by relatively limited strikes, spread over long periods with frequent pauses for political purposes. Linebacker, I said, was different in both scale and intensity. Every night, massive formations of B-52s were striking targets across the Hanoi and Haiphong areas. The bombs were destroying critical infrastructure with systematic efficiency. Railroad yards were being obliterated, cutting the rail links that brought supplies from China. Port facilities were being smashed, preventing the unloading of ships. Warehouses were exploding, destroying stockpiled supplies. Power plants were being wrecked, plunging entire districts into darkness. Communications facilities were being leveled, disrupting command and control. The sheer tonnage of bombs being dropped was staggering. Each night's raids delivered thousands of tons of high explosives on target. Over the course of 11 days, B-52s alone would drop approximately 15,000 tons of bombs on the Hanoi and Haiphong areas, and when the contributions of tactical aircraft were included, the total exceeded 40,000 tons. To put this in perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had an explosive yield equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT. In 11 days, the United States was dropping the equivalent of nearly 3 Hiroshima bombs and conventional explosives on North Vietnam's heartland, and unlike nuclear weapons, these conventional bombs could be precisely aimed at specific targets rather than simply obliterating everything within a radius. The psychological impact on North Vietnamese leadership and population was profound. Hanoi had been bombed before, but never with this intensity, and never with this evident determination to continue, regardless of losses. Previous bombing campaigns had been constrained by political considerations, with targets restricted, certain areas declared off-limits, and frequent pauses to allow for diplomatic initiatives. Linebacker II operated under far fewer restrictions. The target list was comprehensive. The attacks were relentless, and there was no indication that the Americans intended to stop until they had achieved their objectives. For the first time in the war, North Vietnamese leaders faced the realistic possibility that their entire logistical and industrial infrastructure would be destroyed, that their capital would be reduced to rubble, and that they would be unable to continue the war effort regardless of their will to fight. The North Vietnamese fired over 1,200 SA-2 missiles during Linebacker II, an extraordinary expenditure that drained their stocks to critical levels. Soviet resupply could not keep pace with the rate of expenditure, particularly as the Chinese, through whose territory the supplies had to pass, were not always cooperative. North Vietnamese missile crews were exhausted, having worked around the clock for days, often under bombardment themselves as American aircraft struck at the missile sites. The integrated air defense system, while it had inflicted losses on the attackers, was being systematically degraded. Radar sites were being destroyed, missile batteries were being suppressed, and the coordination that had made the system effective was breaking down under the sustained assault. Meanwhile, American tactics were evolving in response to losses and to intelligence gathered during the operation. After the heavy losses of the first few nights, mission planners began varying approach routes, altitudes, and timing to make the bomber streams less predictable. They increased the use of chaff, with specialized aircraft laying down corridors of radar reflecting strips to confuse North Vietnamese radars. They employed more aggressive defense suppression, with wild weasel aircraft hunting and attacking SA-2 sites before and during the bomber strikes. They adjusted formation tactics, spreading the bomber cells to reduce the effectiveness of missiles aimed at massed formations. Most controversially from an operational security standpoint, they began using more varied tactics that made the missions less predictable, but also more complex to plan and execute. The North Vietnamese defenders, despite their courage and determination, were fighting a losing battle of attrition. Their missile stocks were being depleted faster than they could be replaced. Their gun crews were exhausted. Their radar operators were struggling to track targets through increasingly effective American countermeasures. Their MiG fighters, while occasionally successful in harassing the bomber formations, were being shot down by American escorts and were unable to inflict significant losses on the B-52s themselves. Most critically, the targets they were defending were being destroyed despite their best efforts. The railroad yards that had been the backbone of North Vietnam's logistics system were cratered wastelands. The port facilities that had received supplies from the Soviet Union and China were burning ruins. The warehouses that had stored ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment were smoking craters. On December 26, after a 36-hour pause for Christmas, the bombing resumed with the largest single-day effort of the campaign. Over 120 B-52 struck targets in the Hanoi area in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed the remaining defenses. This raid, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously and employing all the tactical lessons learned in the previous attacks, broke the back of North Vietnamese resistance. Only 2 B-52s were lost, despite the massive scale of the attack. demonstrating that American tactics had evolved to effectively counter the North Vietnamese defenses. More importantly, the raid destroyed remaining critical targets and made clear to Hanoi's leadership that the bombing could and would continue at this intensity for as long as necessary. By December 29th, when the last Linebacker II missions were flown, the North Vietnamese had been brought to the brink of logistical collapse. Their transportation infrastructure was shattered, their industrial facilities were wrecked, their air defenses were depleted and exhausted. Their population was demoralized by the relentless bombardment. Most significantly, their leadership recognized that continued resistance would result only in additional destruction, without preventing American bombs from falling. On December 30th, North Vietnam agreed to return to peace negotiations in Paris, without preconditions, the exact outcome that President Nixon had sought to achieve through Operation Linebacker II. The final accounting of Linebacker II revealed the intensity of the operation and its costs. American forces had flown 729 B-52 sorties and over 1,000 fighter-bomber sorties over the 11 days of the operation. They had dropped over 40,000 tons of bombs, with the B-52s alone delivering approximately 15,000 tons. 15 B-52s had been lost to enemy action, along with several other aircraft types. 33 American airmen had been killed or remained missing, and another 33 were captured by the North Vietnamese. These losses were significant and painful, but they were far lower than what North Vietnamese defenses should theoretically have been able to inflict, given the number of sorties flown and the strength of the defenses engaged. From a purely military perspective, Linebacker II demonstrated several important principles that would influence air power doctrine for decades afterward. First, it proved that strategic bombing could achieve political objectives when applied with sufficient intensity and determination. Previous bombing campaigns in Vietnam had failed largely because they had been too gradual, too restricted by political considerations, and too susceptible to interruption. Linebacker I succeeded because it was massive, concentrated, and sustained. Second, it demonstrated that even heavily defended targets could be struck successfully if attackers were willing to accept losses, adapt their tactics, and maintain pressure. The North Vietnamese air defenses were formidable, but they were not impenetrable, and they could be overwhelmed through a combination of tactical innovation, electronic warfare, defense suppression, and sheer persistence. Third, Linebacker II validated the concept of the B-52 as a conventional bombing platform, a role that had not been envisioned when the aircraft was originally designed, but which would become its primary mission for the remainder of its service life. The B-52 proved to be remarkably versatile, capable of delivering enormous tonnages of conventional munitions with good accuracy, able to operate in heavily defended airspace when properly supported, and resilient enough to absorb damage and continue functioning. Aircraft that were hit by missile fragments and suffered significant damage often managed to return to base rather than being destroyed outright, a testament to the robust design of the aircraft and the skill of its crews. Fourth, the operation demonstrated the critical importance of electronic warfare in modern air operations. The B-52's survival depended heavily on their electronic countermeasures equipment, which jammed North Vietnamese radars, deceived missile guidance systems, and provided warning of threats. The evolution of American tactics during Linebacker II was largely driven by lessons learned about how to most effectively employ these electronic warfare capabilities. Future air campaigns would place even greater emphasis on electronic warfare, recognizing it as essential to survival in the modern air defense environment. The North Vietnamese perspective on Linebacker II was complex and in some ways contradictory. Publicly, they claimed victory, pointing to the B-52 pointing to the B-52s they had shot down and arguing that they had defeated the American bombing campaign through the heroic resistance of their air defense forces. They emphasized the civilian casualties caused by the bombing, though these were far lower than they claimed, and far lower than would have resulted from less precisely targeted attacks. They accused the United States of war crimes and compared Linebacker II to the Nazi bombing of cities during World War II, comparisons that were both historically inaccurate and politically motivated. Privately, however, North Vietnamese leaders acknowledged that Linebacker II had been devastatingly effective and that it had forced them back to negotiations from a position of weakness rather than strength. The destruction of their logistical infrastructure had made it impossible to sustain military operations in the South at previous levels. The psychological impact of the bombing on both leadership and population had been severe, demonstrating that American willpower had not been exhausted and that the United States remained capable of inflicting unacceptable damage when it chose to do so. Most significantly, the operation had invalidated North Vietnamese assumptions about American constraints and vulnerabilities, forcing a reassessment of their negotiating strategy. The peace agreement signed in Paris in January 1973 was not significantly different in its terms from what had been on the table in October 1972 before the breakdown of negotiations that had prompted Linebacker II. However, the context was entirely different. In October, the North Vietnamese had walked away from negotiations believing they could achieve better terms through patience and political pressure on the United States. In January, they signed an agreement knowing that the alternative was the resumption of bombing at Linebacker 10 intensity levels, something they could not survive. Whether the agreement would have held without Linebacker Thai is impossible to determine. But what is clear is that the operation achieved its immediate objective of forcing North Vietnam back to negotiations and compelling agreement to terms they had previously rejected. The 11 days of Linebacker II represented the most intense application of strategic air power in a limited war context in history. It demonstrated that old weapon systems, when employed with determination and tactical sophistication, could remain effective even against modern defenses. It proved that air power alone could achieve specific political objectives without the need for ground invasion or occupation. It validated decades of strategic bombing theory that had been questioned and criticized throughout the Vietnam War, and it showed that the B-52 Stratofortress, the aircraft that North Vietnam had laughed at and dismissed as obsolete, was in fact a devastating instrument of war when employed without the political restrictions that had constrained its use throughout most of the conflict. The North Vietnamese had underestimated both the aircraft and the determination of those who flew it, and in 11 days of fire and thunder, they paid the price for that miscalculation.